I'm Brianna Bailey from the Oklahoman, and I'm here with Oklahoma's senior U.S. Senator Jim Inhofe. He's the chairman of the U.S. Senate Environment and Public Works Committee, and he is also one of the few members of Congress that has been licensed as a commercial pilot. And I've just been chatting with him about being home for the holidays from Washington, and he says he has 20 kids and grandkids that are walking distance from his house. So
that's pretty good, isn't it?
Thanks for joining us today.
Thank you, Brianna.
How you doing?
Good, good.
Great. So one of the things I wanted to ask you about was the $1.1 trillion spending bill that Congress just passed, and maybe you could point out some highlights from that for us.
I can do that, Brianna, because there's a lot of misinformation going around. Now, I have to say that the way it was done is wrong. What we should be doing in the House and the Senate is doing appropriation bills, 12 appropriation bills each year. And that should be our funding source and the mechanism that we use. Now, the problem with that is, you know, all the criticism the House was getting when we went through this process wrong, they weren't at fault. The House did things right. They passed their appropriation bills. When it came over to the Senate, we in the Republican Party were a majority. We have 12 bills. We passed all 12 bills out of committee. This is several months ago, so we were way ahead of the game. However, on a partisan basis, the Democrats, it just takes one to stop something from getting to the floor, and on procedural votes, they stopped us, so we couldn't pass even any of the appropriation bills. So the only way to do it then is to have an omnibus bill at the end of the year. Now, the accusation that this costs a lot more than the appropriations would have cost, that's wrong. Because you point out, 1.1 trillion, it's a lot of money, it's too much money, but it's the same as if we had gone through and done it the way we should have done with appropriation bills. So, but I'd like to mention, because the public a lot of them are listening to some of the talk radio shows, and they've been wrong on these issues, and I want to mention 5 things, very briefly, that I think might stimulate some questions from you, Brianna, and might enlighten some of the people out there who otherwise have not been exposed to this. I start with the big one. That's lifting the ban on exporting oil and gas. This is something we've been working on for a long time. Now, this ban has been on for 40 years, and it wasn't until we had this surge in production of oil and gas in this country that's become significant, because now we're in a position where we need to export. Before we weren't, but now we do. Now, give me an idea. We're interested, of course, in Oklahoma, because what it does for the oil and gas industry, that's a huge, huge, huge employer for Oklahoma. But there's something else having to do with national security that's even more important. We have the countries that are out there, most of them are the former Soviet Union countries. They're out there, and they are forced to get all of their oil and gas from Russia or Iran. Well, now, they're not our friends, and they're not looking after our interests. And consequently, those countries who want to be with us can't do it because they are forced to buy their oil and gas elsewhere. Well, now we've lifted the ban, and they can come and immediately. I just had a lunch with several people from some of the 3 large companies that are here in Oklahoma. They're immediately going to firing up their ships. They're ready to go and start it immediately. So that's going to be a help. Let me just mention, as an example, in the Ukraine. Ukraine has been an ally of the United States for as long as I can remember. Ukraine, the president is Poroshenko, the prime minister is Yatsenyuk. I met with them back during their parliamentary elections. Now, in the Ukraine, in order to get a seat in parliament, you have to get 5% of the vote. For the first time in 96 years, they don't have one communist in the parliament in Ukraine. Now, why is that? It's because they're pro-United States. They're pro-West. And yet, when Putin went in and started killing them after that election, killing the freedom guys in Ukraine, our president did nothing. I mean, Obama just sat. We sent blankets. Well, just as one example, and I say this for 2 reasons. One, on this bill on lifting the ban on oil exports allows us now to do it, because they were complaining they have the hammer over them because they supply the energy. Now we can do that. And we also have something in this bill that allows us to send lethal help to Ukraine instead of just blankets. So it gives you an idea how far-reaching this thing is. This president he's down toward his last year now of 2 terms, and so he has his legacy list. One of his legacies is to close Gitmo. And we have language in here that prohibits transferring those Gitmo terrorists to the United States. I don't know why, I can't imagine any logical person wanting to approve that, but the president was wanting to do it. As a matter of fact, when he first took office, one of the collection points for terrorists was going to be Fort Sill, because they have a facility down there. And the people who are at Gitmo right now, they're not the criminal element. They're terrorists. And so what do terrorists do? They are in the business of training other people to be terrorists. So anyway, in this bill, we prohibit them transferring any of the detainees to the United States. The bill stops the funding of the president's Green Climate Fund. We saw, and I'm hoping that more people would pay attention to what went on or didn't go on in Paris during their last big event there, because they didn't pass anything that was binding. It was a total failure, but they had to somehow come up with something to make it look good, and it wasn't. Well, one of the things that they talk about was this Green Climate Fund of $100 billion, of which our President Obama said we're going to be contributing a lot of it to that. Well, we were able to stop our funding of the Green Climate Fund. And the last thing I'll mention, to anyone out there who's interested in Second Amendment rights, I'm talking about the gun owners and others. We had the biggest threat to gun owners was when they had the United Nations Treaty on Arms. And what we did in this bill was prohibit any funding for the UN Arms Treaty, and they should be celebrating in the streets, the people who believe in the Second Amendment rights, and they're not out there. So I'm saying those are 5 things that are just huge in terms of good things that happen and things that wouldn't have happened otherwise. Each one of these 5 things, if that were done during the normal appropriation process, the president could have vetoed each one of them individually, and they'd sustain his veto. So it was not the way we should have done it, but these 5 things wouldn't have happened if it hadn't been done this way.
So circling back to the end on the lifting of the crude oil ban, you mentioned the irregular appropriations process. What were some of the barriers to getting that repealed? Because I know it's something that you and our congressional delegation worked on for a long time.
We have President Obama's war on fossil fuels. You know, he's announced that long before he was president. He wants to kill fossil fuels. Now, in Oklahoma, and the reason I'm back here quite often is just to talk to Oklahomans, because there aren't any normal people in Washington. They ask questions like, wait a minute, if we're dependent upon fossil fuels for 75% of the power that we generate to run this machine called America, how do you take fossil fuels out and still run this machine called America? The answer is you can't do it. And so this was just part of the war to preclude us from lifting that ban, because obviously if our domestic industry is able to export oil and gas, it's going to be something very good. It's going to promote, not diminish, fossil fuels. So this is something that he didn't want, and he would have vetoed in a heartbeat. So this has been a fight, and I think that we all hear in the last 7 years this president's been in office, he talks about trying to stop the process called well, it's hydraulic fracturing. By coincidence, I was down in Duncan, Oklahoma yesterday. Duncan is where 1948 was the first time they ever used hydraulic fracturing. That's when the process started. Now, by their own admission, there has not been one case, documented case, of groundwater contamination from hydraulic fracturing. But the president knows that if he can stop hydraulic fracturing, he can stop this shale revolution that's going on right now, which is part of his war. So all of that we had to overcome in order to get this done. And I have to confess, there's one other thing too. A month ago, I was the author of the big highway bill that we passed. And they were wanting to put this issue in there, and that, of course, it doesn't fit in a highway bill. But I said, well, I'll tell you what, if you promise me that it's going to be in the omnibus bill if we have to do one, then I won't complain about not having it in the highway bill. So we've been talking about this ever since the shale revolution came in.
Great. So moving on to the highway bill that you mentioned, so this was a more than $300 billion highway bill. So Oklahoma is supposed to get about $3 billion over the next 5 years for roads and bridges.
3.6, I think.
3.6 billion, okay. And another, my numbers say $240 million for transit. Mm-hmm. So my question for you is, you know, how will this benefit the state? How much of a funding increase is it over the last highway bill? And then would Oklahoma have gotten more money if earmarks were still allowed? Well,
there actually are. You could argue that there are earmarks now in this area, and that's another issue that's certainly misunderstood by not just Oklahomans but all of the American people. The highway bill, you approach it two ways. Either you have, and we had, for example, what we passed a month ago was a major transportation reauthorization bill. The last one we passed was 2005. The one before that was 1998. So this is something that's done and you want to have it multiple years. During the years that the Republicans were not in control of the United States Senate, we didn't pass one, and all we had is short-term extensions. Now it happens that we have a guy named Gary Ridley in the state of Oklahoma. He's the Secretary of Transportation. He is recognized nationwide as being the foremost authority in roads and highways, so he's a huge help. He will tell you that if we just do the short-term extensions, you can't plan a bridge, you can't plan a major intersection, you can't do what you need to be doing because you're only doing it a month at a time or 2 months at a time. You can't line up your labor. So this is an area where labor was joining industry and trying to get this done. So the big difference, in answer to your question, is we're through, at least for the term of this 5-year bill, with short-term extensions. So now we can plan. A lot of these projects that we're going to be working on are maybe 10-year projects, but you have to have this funding arranged for it so you can finish a project that you start today, which you can't do on short-term funding. So I would say that if you drive around through the state of Oklahoma and you find some areas that really need to be improved, well, rather than to let the local, a lot of times politicians will go where their strongest force is and do things for them, and that's the type of thing they do that I find offensive. What we do is we'll go to the State Department of Transportation. They are divided into districts. It used to be 6, now it's 8, or vice versa. But they'll have one person from each district to prioritize all of the issues, the transportation issues, bridges and all that, in that particular area. Then they get together and they say, all right, in the formula, Oklahoma is going to get $3.6 billion worth of work over the next 5 years, even though the work will extend far beyond that. And what should we have done? So I would just say that, to answer your question, you drive around Oklahoma, the thing that you find most difficult to drive on is going to be corrected.
Great. So I also wanted to ask you about the overhaul, the bill that overhauls the Toxic Substances Control Act of 1976. Mm-hmm. You were able to get it through the Senate right before they adjourned for the year.
Just the day before, yes.
Yes, and I spoke with our Washington correspondent, Chris Castile, and he said that this is something that has been kind of hanging around for years without...
it's 40 years.
Yes.
Yeah, and here, I'll tell you what's funny about this, Brianna. Most of our audience out there, they know all about the highway bill. They don't know about the chemical bill that's called TSCA, and it's all manufacturers, all producers, everyone uses chemicals. And so the chemical structure hasn't been changed. Some chemicals are dangerous. Some we need to ration in certain areas, and they need to be treated in relationship to any hazards that might be surrounding them. So we have a bill that will do that. There are some chemicals that have no harm to anyone, and so they've been crying around the country, not just in Oklahoma, but everywhere, to have an overhaul of that system since it was put in place 40 years ago. Well, we have done that. Now, it happens, you mentioned in your introduction that I chair the committee called Environment and Public Works. This is one of the things that is in that committee that we deal with in our jurisdiction. So there are some people who are opposed to it in the Senate, in this case Barbara Boxer from California, because they have their own problems there that they're not taken care of, and they don't want to be under the jurisdiction, a federal jurisdiction. Nonetheless, we won, they lost, and we have a bill. In fact, I have to say this, the committee that I chair, the Environment and Public Works Committee, that has the broadest jurisdiction of any of the committees in the Senate. And by the way, I want to mention I also have that my other committee is the Armed Services Committee, which is huge right now because of what's going on over there and the threats that we're facing in this country.
So I also wanted to ask you a little bit about climate change. You know, you've been a long time naysayer about climate change, and you said that the idea that humans are causing global warming is a hoax. Earlier this year, you brought a snowball to the Senate floor to kind of try to illustrate that point, and I have something for you today. I thought you would appreciate this. I give this to you.
Oh,
I picked you some flowers. It's 2 days before Christmas.
Well, isn't that
I picked
nice?
those for you.
Well, thank you
I
very
put a
much.
Christmas bow on them.
Uh-huh.
So.
A Christmas bow
Yeah,
and flowers.
yeah.
Good for you.
So.
Well, let me kind of go back.
Yeah.
Let's go back in the beginning of this thing. Way back in the turn of the century, about 2000, 2001, I was a believer. I thought, you know, all the smart people were saying, well, this is, you know, the world's we're all gonna die, and it's because of global warming. Well, and I chaired the subcommittee of this committee we've been talking about that has jurisdiction over that particular issue. I believed that until I found out back then, if we were to pass cap and trade, this is what they wanted, to cap your emissions and then trade, and it's a very expensive process, that the cost of that would be range between $300 and $400 billion a year. So I thought, well, if that's the case, let's be sure that the science is there. Once I questioned the science, we got inundated in my Senate office with scientists all over saying this whole thing has been cooked up by the United Nations. The IPCC is the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, and this is the United Nations. And we had testimonial from scientists who were kicked off that panel because they wouldn't go along with their conclusions. And so I got to thinking, wait a minute, the science is not settled, and it's still not settled today. So I questioned it, and in fact, several people, including not just Democrats, but John McCain, actually was the author of the first bill that would be a cap and trade bill. And we beat him on it because of the cost and the fact that the science isn't settled. Excuse me. But so they've come up, Al Gore was the worst. He'd come up and say, well, you know, in the Mount Kilimanjaro is all going to melt and it's going to fall down and all these things are going to happen. Well, none of them happened. It was all in his imagination. Now, he has accomplished what he wants. According to the New York Times, Al Gore is the first environmental billionaire. He's made more money he can spend the rest of his life on this issue. And so there are a lot of others around there. And there's some who you may wonder on the Senate floor why you have people still making, even though the public has caught on and they understand what the issue is. There's a guy, for example, one guy named Tom Steyer. Tom Steyer has said he'd put $100 million into Senate campaigns to get people elected that will try to resurrect the global warming as an issue. And why do we say that, and does he say that? Because back when we started, I can remember when the Gallup poll that came out every March, it always had global warming as either the #1 or #2 problem. Today it's last, dead last, number 15. And so the people realize that, you know, that a lot of this stuff that they've been talking about. So we have this the big parties that the United Nations has every year. The 21st party, annual party, just took place in Paris. And all of them went over there to say, yes, we're going to, everyone make a commitment, every country make a commitment as to what they're going to do for their future in terms of the emissions of CO2. And so our president came out and said, yes, I commit the United States to reducing its CO2 emissions by between 26 and 28% by 2025. And then when we asked him, how do you want to do that, he won't talk, because there's no way that it can be done. In fact, they even refused to testify before the Committee of Jurisdiction over the EPA to tell us how they're going to do it, and they won't do that. One of the things, since a lot of people are listening now who really believe and really bought into this, I would suggest one thing. The first EPA director that was appointed by President Obama was, her name was Jackson, Lisa Jackson, and she was fired shortly after, but she, before our committee, live on TV, I asked her the question. I said, now if we pass any of this cap and trade stuff here in the United States, will that have the effect of reducing CO2 emissions worldwide? And she said, no, it wouldn't, because this isn't where the problem is. The problem's in China, the problem's in India, the problem's in Mexico. And so on this arrangement that was made concluded in the last couple of weeks in Paris, China, for example, has said, well, here's what we'll commit to. We'll increase our CO2 emissions for 15 more years, then we'll start reducing it. Well, they are currently building every week a coal-fired energy plant in China. So they're not decreasing, they're increasing. India comes along and says, well, it's going to cost over $1 trillion, so we want the developed countries like the United States to pay us, and then we'll do it. So it completely fell apart, and the main thing I'm thankful for is that the public has caught on.
So what do you think the solution is, or do you think there needs to be one about capping CO2 emissions, from developing countries and the United States? Well,
because the developing countries, I spend a lot of time, I've been interested for 20 years in Africa. In Africa, they just want anything at all that will produce energy. And yet they're trying, a lot of people are trying to get them not to use any kind of fossil fuels. Well, you can't do it. I mean, you're saying, it can't happen. So you go back and you say, well, does it really need to happen? Well, I'm going to run you through, and I'm going to do this from memory. We're going through cycles today. We've gone through cycles since the beginning of recorded time. In 1895, that began a cold cycle, and that was the first time they used the new ice age, that term, and that lasted about 30 years. That lasted until 2018. Then 2018, it turned around. We went into a warming period. That lasted until 1945, another 30 years after that. Well, then in 1945, it reversed and started another cooling era that went to 1975. Now, the interesting part of that is the greatest surge in CO2 happened right after World War II, which is 1945, and that precluded not a warming period, but a cooling period. I just say, God is still up there. We're always going to have these cycles, and it has always happened. It will continue to happen. By the way, they'll make up things to say, like our president, when they kicked off this meeting in Paris, he said the last 15 years have been the warmest 15 years in history. And immediately NASA and NOAA came out and said, no, they're not either. Where are you coming from? So I just ask people to look at the documentation and keep in mind the motives of some of these people.
So it's one thing to say that the science isn't settled, that there are scientists who say that no humans aren't causing the climate to change, the planet to warm, but we have, whether you agree or not, there's decades of data showing a gradual warming of the Earth, surface temperatures warming, ocean temperatures increasing, and I would wonder, what would it take for you? Would there be anything? Well,
first of all, your premise is wrong.
Okay.
Because if you go back and I was talking about 30-year cycles. You can go back and look at 300-year cycles, and you can see, no, that's not true. We've gone through times when we've gone through long-term warming periods, long-term cooling periods. Even the scientists who want to be on the side, either, I'm not saying they're paid to do it, but the ones who are participating in all the United Nations stuff, they'll say, in reality, the contributing factors are not man. If you look at the history, when you have, just like after World War II, that didn't cause anything to warm at that time. So if there's any contribution that man has made to this, it's something less than 0.1%, and they admit that, and they're on the other side of this thing. So I just don't agree with that. I've looked at the long-term, the charts that go all the way back to the beginning of time that have the tree circles and all of this that measure temperatures over hundreds of years, and we've gone through these cycles for as long as it's been recorded. However, there are a lot of people who really believe the premise that you just made, and one of the problems there is that with the influence of the EPA and of government on our kids' education. I had one of my grandkids, when she was in the 7th grade, and came and she said, Popeye, see, I is for Inhofe, so it's Mama and Popeye. So why is it you don't understand global warming? And I said, well, why would you ask that? And she showed me the stuff that they're teaching them in school now. And that's another thing that needs to be addressed.
Would there be anything that would occur that would maybe make you change your mind, or maybe make you think twice, hey, maybe there's something to this global warming business?
If we had some evidence that came up, but we've looked at every piece of evidence is there, and nothing would, so far, has come up that would come to that conclusion. That number one, we're having, or in fact, in a warming period that we have is unprecedented, which isn't true, or number two, that this can be affected by to me, it's pretty arrogant to think that man can do something that's going to affect something, climate. Weather's one thing, climate is another.
Okay. Well, is there anything else that we didn't talk about that you'd like to let people know, or
well, I would go back to this, just elaborate a little bit on what happened in Paris, because this is the 21st meeting that they've had of all the states. And when you talk to those who are there, most of them are there because they think that they'll walk away with large amounts of money. I'm talking about our developing countries. But if you look at what happened there, first of all, they can't say it's successful because no targets for emissions were established, no enforcement mechanism is there, and no funding mechanism is there. And as I mentioned, James Hansen, who was the founder of this whole thing, the first guy back in the 80s talking about global warming, he characterized what happened last month in Paris as a fraud. We've already covered the fact that there's no way to accomplish what the president has committed us to, but I think one of the revealing things, two things that are really revealing and need to be looked at, and that is the fact that China is saying, yes, I'm going to continue, we're going to continue, that's the world's largest emitter. And then at the very last, when they're trying to put a document together, they changed the word shall to should. And the reason they did that is because if they have should in there, they were fearful that that would trigger a vote in the Senate, because anything that should, anything that is an absolute, would have to be ratified by the Senate. And they didn't want to be embarrassed because they couldn't get 30 votes out of 100 votes to ratify. I guess what I'm saying is, I'm not the only one out there. I'm a vast majority of the members that I serve with, except others are not. They're a little bit cautious and a little bit afraid of the issue. When you have one guy like Tom Steyer saying, all right, we're going to try to resurrect this issue. To do this, we've got to have night sessions and everybody get down there. You saw a bunch of them doing that. Mm-hmm. Didn't change the public opinion at all. And the point I wanted to get across on the omnibus spending bill is that there's a solution. The last talk I gave on the last week on the Senate floor was all we have to do to keep this from happening again is to pass our appropriation bills. In order to do that, we have to, instead of having to have 60 votes required in the Senate. We just changed that to in terms of appropriation bills, just a majority. And then we can do appropriation bills where everyone in the country can look and see exactly what we're doing, what's going to get funding and what isn't going to get funding. There's a solution to that problem.
Okay. So what are you going to do for Christmas?
Well, I've got 20 kids and grandkids, and I'll be seeing all of them, and that's enough.
All right. Well, thank you so much for coming in and talking with us today.
Well, Merry Christmas to you.
Thank you. Merry Christmas
to everybody out there.
Thank you.